They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there.
We don't need to go populist left or populist right. We don't need to embrace neo-Marxism or neo-fascism, these disastrous movements from the 20th century. Turns out the answer is pretty much our Bill of Rights, our story. Embrace freedom. That's the answer.
And if the LP has a purpose, it's not to put people to sleep. It's to wake them up.
We're here because we love liberty, and we're here because we hate injustice. We are here to save mankind. We are here to fight.
Join us, the Libertarian Party, in perhaps the most exciting, grandest endeavor in history, the restoration of American liberty.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
Hello and welcome to episode 86 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises PAC. I'm Aaron Harris and I'm your host. Of course, one of the things that we are always concerned about here at the Mises Caucus is war and peace. As libertarians, we favor peace. We are wholeheartedly against war, and we sometimes are annoying on Twitter and things like that when talking about war and peace. But I think it's shocking how poorly informed so many people are on what's actually going on foreign policy wise. As Scott Horton says, to the news media, history started last week, and they look at each international incident in whatever very narrow framework they want to put on it, that usually doesn't get at what's actually happened historically. And so even though we libertarians are often kind of annoying on this, we are usually better informed than the people that we debate, and that gets kind of depressing sometimes when you're debating someone who doesn't really take the time to know the topic, but they still have a very strong sense that they're right. And for the Exhibit A in that, I would point you to Scott Horton's Soho Forum debate with Bill Kristol. It was amazing how ill-prepared Kristol was and how well Scott did. Of course, no one's surprised that Scott did well, but just in contrast to how Bill Kristol handled it was pretty amazing. And along with Scott Horton and Daniel McAdams, who we've also had on the show here recently, one of the best libertarian foreign policy analysts is my guest today, Kyle Anzalone. He's the news editor over at the Libertarian Institute with Scott Horton. He's also the co-host of Conflicts of Interest, that podcast that is a good way to keep up to date on just in really great detail on what's happening foreign policy-wise, as is, of course, the Scott Horton Show. And Kyle Anzalone is also the opinion editor over at antiwar.com. If you don't read antiwar.com or don't go there when you want to know about foreign policy and war and peace, then you're missing out. So today I talked to Kyle about several things. We kind of focused a lot on Asia, specifically China and Taiwan. You guys know that's a personally important thing to me because of family connections. But I really wanted to, I'm still struggling to understand exactly why the American, the Biden administration and the sort of the deep state is acting toward China the way they do. Kyle is able to shed a little bit of light on that. We also, of course, talk a little bit about Russia, Ukraine, and Yemen. And so anytime you talk to Kyle, you're going to get a lot of facts and a lot of good analysis. This was recorded, I think, on August 18th, so about a week from before you will be hearing it. So I don't think too much is out of date. Maybe some of the Russia stuff might be, but I know you're going to enjoy hearing from Kyle Anzalone. It's a pleasure to have you back on, Kyle. It was great to finally meet you out in Reno. And I thought the funniest thing was like both of us were like, "Oh, I didn't know you were tall," because I both of us are pretty tall, and I guess we're used to encountering more normal sized people. So it was great seeing you out there. What have you been up to? What's going on? What's in the news right now?
Yeah, well, I guess after me and you in Reno, I was also back out in Nevada for Vegas at Freedom Fest. So, it's been a pretty busy couple months for me, but I am still trying to cover the news. My most recent article I co-authored with Will Porter is about the recent North Korea weapons test and trying to really explain that, look, all the news coverage in the United States is talking about the U.S.-Chinese relationship, and that's why the U.S. is carrying out military drills and has military assets in the region. But we have to realize that when we test the Minuteman III ICBM, it's not only a test to see if we could possibly hit China with that weapon, but it's also a test to see if we hit North Korea with that weapon. And North Korea is going to respond to that. They're not just going to take that on its face. They're going to start to carry out their own missile test and response.
So let's go back into that a little more. So they did a missile test over there. How does that actually work? It's not a computer simulation, I'm guessing.
Not most of the time. Most of these missile tests are reported initially either by South Korea or Japan with their radar tracking mechanisms. And so they will put out a statement saying that, we believe it was this North Korean missile, because they have pretty good intelligence on the North Korean missiles. They know the general size, shape, capabilities. And so this particular test was to cruise missiles. Now, cruise missiles have more maneuverability than a ballistic missile, which, essentially you shoot it up and it's on a trajectory. Now, there's been some questions recently about the actual success of North Korea's ICBM test, intercontinental ballistic missile test, that they carried out earlier in the year. It was the first time that they had conducted an ICBM test since, I believe, 2017, and so it was pretty significant. Now, there's some evidence that test did not go as well as planned, and the video footage that North Korea put out was somewhat doctored. But overall, North Korea has carried out a record number of weapon tests in 2022 already for an entire year. I think they passed that mark in May. And so North Korea has been fairly active this year, but in the past 2 months, they've curbed and curtailed the number of tests they were carrying out for whatever reason. And it seems as the U.S. is carrying out all these war games, not only just U.S. warships targeting China, but also involving South Korea and Japan. North Korea sees this as more and more provocative. The U.S. just finished up war games in Hawaii with South Korea and Japan, and these war games were likely at least discussed in Madrid, where the U.S. NATO held a summit, but South Korea and Japan also attended that summit. And at that summit, the U.S. signed a trilateral document with Seoul and Tokyo, and that really upset North Korea. And they said, look, you guys are trying to create an Asian NATO. And yeah, I think, we are starting to see that at this point. And this is, the response that we're seeing from Pyongyang.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing that in the news, we libertarians have been concerned about Yemen for a few years a lot, and then the last 6 months or whatever with Ukraine. But I'm really interested in what's going on in Asia. People who listen know that my mother-in-law is in Taiwan. I would like to live, do winters over there at some point, or even move there if things get I'm in Tennessee, so I'm fairly safe from the collapse here in the United States, maybe. But so I'm really interested in it, but also just because looking ahead, these guys who are controlling foreign policy, they look at this to me as a big game of risk, and thinking in that way, the obvious big next strategic shift is Asia with China. And one of the big stories of the last few years, or one of the handful of things that I was optimistic about Trump with, when the North Korea, talks and all that, I was oh man, this is he should maybe get the Nobel Peace Prize for this. And so where did that go? And how does that fit with, we know North Korea is North Korea, and then China, we could be treating them, there's different ways that a fading superpower like the US could treat a rising power like China. And it seems like both parties and the whole US establishment are just, I don't really get what their strategy is with China. So like with that, are they trying to form a NATO like that? And is China and North Korea, how do they relate to each other? Just kind of talk about what you see happening over the next few years in Asia.
Okay, so I guess if I miss anything, please remind me at the end, and I'll go through all this. But
I'm the worst. I ask the worst questions because I ask 7 questions at once. But just give us an overview of what's going on.
I do the same thing. I host I've done 800 shows. I do the same thing. That's why I said just remind me if I forget that. So I guess the first thing I think maybe the most important thing to acknowledge with all of this is I really do believe that if the China would not be catching the U.S., or at least not catching the U.S. at such a pace as if it wasn't for the U.S. militarism and interventionism all over the world, including in the Indo-Pacific. And so, the U.S. has a long-term plan to build missiles on what they call the first island chain, and those are the islands closest off of China's coast, all the way through the Pacific and the South China Sea. And I think this is a really expensive project. It's costing the U.S. a lot of geopolitical capital. Pretty much all the diplomacy that the U.S. engages in these days are just to build up their military presence, either in Europe, Africa, or the Indo-Pacific. And so, this is all costing the U.S. a lot. And so I don't want to say it should be a foregone conclusion that China is going to catch the U.S. and that this is actually going to be a problem. However, I do think it's going to end up being a problem because of the current U.S. actions, if that makes some sense here. So, I guess the first thing we should go over here is what Trump did in this particular region, because he was very, very aggressive towards China. But on North Korea, I think we saw what was the best hope that we could have for Trump, right? He comes into office and he's saying all this ridiculous stuff about fire and fury and calling Kim Jong-un little rocket man and all this other nonsense, right? But then once things get serious, he engages in actual diplomacy with the North Koreans. He's not starting at the base point for U.S. diplomacy with North Korea. That's been the case for so many years, which is North Korea must denuclearize, and then we could engage in talks. Trump just, went and started engaging in talks with Kim Jong-un. This was absolutely fantastic. One of the best decisions, probably the best decision a president has made on Korea policy in 30 years or so. However, the problem with Trump is he didn't understand how to govern. He didn't understand that personnel makes policy. And so whenever he fired H.R. McMaster, he hired John Bolton. And what did John Bolton do? He went to Hanoi and he ruined all the diplomacy and talks with North Korea. And I think maybe even worse, I think it really did fundamental structural damage to at least the relationship between Kim Jong-un and the United States. He feels like he really took a chance to engage and talk with the Americans, and that Trump just completely threw that out the window on a whim, and that this was a real problem and insult for Kim Jong-un. He made a big tour to even get to Hanoi, and then the U.S. kind of threw some different proposals on the North Koreans at the last minute that crossed clear red lines. And so that was the worst part of Donald Trump's policy, right? The time he goes to the DMZ later in his administration, he has Tucker Carlson with him, not his national security advisor, John Bolton. And so, maybe finally at the end, he started to get some of this, but overall, he wasn't able to get anything done on the Korea issue. And so, what good was all of his diplomacy anyways? And like I said, I think in a way it structurally deterred Kim Jong-un from negotiating with the United States, because he kind of, now has this idea that, look, anytime we even get close, the Americans are going to walk back out of it anyways. Now, on on China policy, I think Donald Trump was worse than maybe any president that we've ever had. Of course, Obama started with the pivot to Asia, putting more military assets in the region, but Donald Trump really, really increased this and ramped this up. And in response, Beijing has increased their investment in their military, particularly in what they call their A2D2 area access area denial strategy, where rather than, trying to have the ability to take Hawaii from the United States or put aircraft carriers or something off the coast of California, China's goal is to keep the U.S. out of a couple hundred miles of their coastline. And so, this means the South China Sea, the all the islands that are contested out there. And look, China's claims in this region seem really, really absurd. But at the same time, China is a powerful enough country that if they want a limited military strategy of being able to have some control in these islands, China is likely able to do that. And then, of course, this is Taiwan, which China and U.S. policy technically says is an internal Chinese issue. The U.S. policy is one China. That means China and Taiwan are the same political entity. That's enshrined in U.S. law. That's the way we should view this. But what the U.S. has done in recent years is really not say specifically that we want Taiwan to be independent, but to say that we're going to defend Taiwan over and over again. And this has created a near de facto situation that there, I think, is a belief among a lot of people in the United States, probably a lot of people in Taiwan, that if China were to attack, the U.S. would defend Taiwan. I don't think that's actually going to be the case. I don't think there's going to be a lot the U.S. could do. And I also don't think, we would actually see Beijing attack Taiwan. I think the move would be to blockade the island. I don't think it would be that hard for Beijing to do that at a far lower military cost. And then from there, the strategy would be to just force more and more concessions from Taipei in order to have access to any kind of goods or international trade. And so I think maybe that's what we're going to see in the future if the U.S. keeps up with this current trend. It's important to note that for everything that's gone on, this entire time for the past 50 years, China has maintained that, reunification with Taiwan will be peaceful. And even in their latest policy statements on the issue, that they continue to say this.
Yeah, I no one hates, the Chinese Communist Party more than me. I mean, literally, and as a libertarian, this is an issue that I really have an emotional trouble with, because, my sort of tribal gut instinct is like, yeah, we should defend Taiwan because, my mother-in-law and my cousins and my cousin's little kids are over, my wife's cousin's kids are over there. So but my brain and my sort of, my libertarian morality is like, how, just how horrible that would be to actually have a conflict start over that. Yeah, I have 12 questions here. But my impression is that China, the one thing that I think Americans don't understand about China, and I think the same way we don't understand, the Islamic world or even Russia, is, we have a very small attention span as Americans. And I think that China, to focus on them, they really think in terms of the next 500 years. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. I mean, they're politicians. They want to extract as much, resources and power out of what they have while they have, but also just there's something about the Asian culture of people are making money, right? There's business between Taiwan and China. There's travel back and forth. It's a very weird thing. The older generation in Taiwan is more likely to want unification. People our age and younger kind of favor independence, but they realize that it's tricky. So, but I genuinely think that I don't think we're going to wake up one morning and there's going to be, aircraft or personnel ships, landing in on the East Coast or the West Coast of Taiwan. I don't think that's going to happen just because it's costly, and they don't want. I think China doesn't want any sort of resistance or bad will on their hands, because they want to make money, and they do see Taiwan as their wayward cousins and stuff. So I think that they want to do it peacefully. I think what happened in Hong Kong, and I'd be curious as your take on this, what happened in Hong Kong kind of scotched any, I think Taiwan would be much less likely to trust any sort of deal with China because of that. But am I right that I don't think that there's going to be like an invasion or something super violent unless the U.S. Blunders into forcing China to do something like that? Am I close on that, do you think?
Yeah, and what you're saying sounds an awful lot like a recent article in The American Conservative by Peter Van Buren, who's a diplomat with 30 years of experience in this region. I think is one of the best analysis on this issue. And he points out, again, the trade between Taiwan and China makes a lot of people in both countries very wealthy. There's a lot of people that are going back and forth to visit their relatives. You know what I mean? Like, your cousin lives in Taiwan, you live in China, you don't want a war to break out between those two places. And, I think that there's a lot of people in China who have relatives in Taiwan, still pretty close relations. There's a lot of people who vacation in the two countries. Now, I think the concern here is that the closer America gets to Taiwan, the more times that Nancy Pelosi and congressional delegations go to Taiwan, China is going to react by cutting trade, by cutting the amount of tourism, by cutting the amount of visas that are allowed for people to go back and forth. And so, if, again, we're not looking at a situation, as you point out, I think China does look and plan by centuries. As you said, 500 years, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but they are definitely looking like 100 years or so down the road. Now, one thing that I think is very important is that, as libertarians, sometimes we'll hear that and think like, oh no, this is actually a problem. We have to address this as libertarians. But come on, this is a centrally planned economy of 1.5 billion people. You think over 100 years they're really going to be that good at planning their economy that they're able to carry out? Taiwan is a big island. It is, it's not that close to China. I mean, it is very close to China because the Pacific Ocean is huge and America is on the other side of it, but that is a lot of ground to cross with a lot of troops if you do plan to invade. There's a lot of issues if China wants to invade. That's why I think they would go with the blockade route and things like that anyways. But I think a lot of your analysis there is right on. I just think we have to remember as libertarians that we really don't have to address this problem. I think in the long term, I think it will kind of solve itself. Now, as you point out, I think the Hong Kong thing probably did make Taiwan more nervous about agreeing to a one party, two systems, or one country, two systems, like Hong Kong had. That being said, I think the people of Taiwan probably do see there's a huge difference in the location of Hong Kong versus Taiwan, right? Like if you're in Hong Kong, there's not a lot you could do militarily, ever could have, to prevent Beijing from coming in, where if you are in Taiwan, you do have that. Now, I guess one more thing I want to point out, and this is from Daniel L. Davis, who, is a whistleblower on Afghanistan. I think just a great, former colonel in the military, very good on this analysis. And one of the things he says is Taiwan actually only maintains at this point about 2/3 of their defensive positions on the island, where they would need to have troops stationed if there was going to be a Chinese invasion. And this is in part because they can't get enough Taiwanese to sign up for the military. And so my sense is, Aaron, that as time goes on, we're going to have a better idea of how concerned the Taiwanese are about this if there's enough young people joining the military because they're concerned about Beijing. But at this point, it doesn't seem to be the case. And so my guess is that we're still years away from an invasion, and I don't think it's a foregone conclusion at all. I think it would have to require a lot of increase in American and Taiwanese military ties. I think if it were up to Beijing, they would just wait another, I'm not even joking, 5, 6, 7 decades and slowly have, like, you know, the size of the Chinese economy, the, you know, just the amount of Chinese people there are in the world, slowly just turn Taiwan back into a formal part of China. And you know, that's openly what the Chinese government is saying in their policies and white papers at this point.
Yeah. And this is just a quick side note. So Taiwan is kind of an island, and I think I'm right on this, but I could be like way wrong. But like, there's most of the population is kind of just on the coast, right? So my wife's parents came from a town called Hualien on the East Coast, which is if they had sandy beaches instead of rocky beaches, this would be the people from. They get a lot of tourists now, but like it's like the most beautiful place. But they do get a lot of tourists from China and Korea and stuff like that. So all the population is kind of on the edges, and then it's very mountainous in the middle. And like, I'm thinking, like, if this was full of, you know, Appalachians like me and my ancestors, like, you would never take that island, because like you might land your ships and take Taipei, but like if they wanted to hold out in the mountains and they had guns and they had a culture that did that, you would never, ever, ever conquer them. But I don't know. I can't get a handle on like whether they actually would, not impugning their bravery or anything like that. I just think that they would probably just like, hey, let's try to make, you know, let's try to keep doing business and maybe things won't be so bad. Because that's one thing about Taiwan is like, it's in some ways you would think it's almost libertarian, just because like anybody can like start a food truck and a business and there's like zero regulations, and there's a lot of economic dynamism, and their culture is they want to make money and have nice things for their kids and send their kids to college somewhere in the US or Britain or, you know, Korea or something, or Taiwan. And so I think you're right. I think the thing I literally pray for is just like, you know, continuing collapse of, you know, the communist system into something much more liberal, and just people making money and having lives, and politicians not doing anything to screw that up, and just letting things evolve the way they would. And that's one thing that, you know, I think Dave and Scott were talking about it on Part of the Problem recently, is like, I think we all have an impulse as libertarians to like, hey, we want to see Ancapistan everywhere, but we simply can't make that happen. And we certainly can't make that happen without like risking like nuclear war, you know, in a place like Taiwan. So, right. My big fear is that, you know, it's the politicians that are going to screw things up. And so I want to talk about the Pelosi visit. And so what was, I think I think it was on that same episode, Dave and Scott talked about it, that so my wife a couple of weeks ago, whenever she's like, oh, you know, Pelosi's going to Taiwan, and my wife's not very political. And I was like, oh, well, I better go buy some like semiconductor stock or whatever, because, you know, there's something fishy going on there. And am I right? Like, what was the visit all about? How bad did China take it? Did that significantly destabilize things, or is it just kind of blow over?
Yeah. So on the first thing you said, I do want to point out that Taiwan isn't without some deterrence for even an invasion from Beijing. They have developed a somewhat capable submarine fleet, and the waters off the east coast of Taiwan are fairly deep. And so that makes it pretty hard to track and locate submarines and things like this. That's why when Ron Paul talked about like how much of the military we could get rid of, he was like, we just need a fleet of submarines that carry around the nuclear weapons because, that's your deterrent. And so that's what you need. And they're, again, really hard to track and find, especially in deep waters and things like that. And so, Taiwan does have deterrent. And I would guess, Aaron, that, if China invaded, maybe it would be different because, there is some kinsmanship between the two sides. But I don't know, if the Japanese came back to Taiwan, they might go up into the mountains and shoot them all until there were none left. Right. So, I think the invader matters here, probably quite a bit. On the Pelosi visit, I'm pretty sure it was Ben Freeman. I'm almost 100% was Ben Freeman at the Quincy Institute. But if it was one of the other great writers they have at the Quincy Institute, my mistake, went through and detailed how lobbyists really put together this trip for Taiwan. They're just people who, have business interests and connections with the Taiwanese government. And I think mostly the business interests that put this together. And from there, it's just political momentum. Even if the DOD didn't want it, even if the Biden administration didn't want it, once Pelosi said she was going, she gets a fighter escort. We're parking 4 warships off the coast of Taiwan to make sure that she's safe while she's there. And of course, China wasn't going to shoot down Nancy Pelosi's plane, even if it flew through Chinese airspace. I mean? They might not have been happy about it. There might have been a lot of protests, but they weren't going to shoot down Nancy Pelosi's plane. And so the idea that I need a fighter escort, I think, a lot of show, but I think it does. I think there's a lot of people that said, the White House clearly didn't want this. I don't know if that's the case. I think there's the initial pushback on it, but once, the politics being what they are in America right now, everybody hates China more than everybody else. Like that's where you have to be good, right? Like Trump attacked Biden for being too close to China, and now Biden is more hawkish on China than Trump ever was, who was 3 steps more hawkish than Obama. And so we're going in a very bad direction here. I don't think there's any way politically, at least within the swamp of Washington, D.C., that this is going to get pulled back. Me and Dave DeCamp had a conversation, who's the news editor at antiwar.com, on the show probably like a year and a half ago. But even like 6 months ago, as everything's kicking off in Ukraine, me and Dave are saying that the military industrial complex, the Washington swamp, still has their sights set on Beijing. This incident in Ukraine, I think, is a little bit more of a side quest kind of thing going on, and the real path to militarism in the future going forward is still through Beijing. And so I think Pelosi's visit is really a part of that. And if Biden really didn't want her to go, he could have prevented it. She's the Speaker of the House in his own party. If he can't get her in line, he's the weakest president. I mean, by massive degrees. I can't even imagine like Mitch McConnell doing something like this to Trump on the Russia issue, right? Or even John McCain. I would find it hard. He's not even the leader of the party, but I can't imagine like these guys like going behind Trump's back to one of these countries and like against his wishes, being more provocative and hawkish. And that's right now what we have in the Democrat Party.
So let's talk about that. And I've talked about this with some other guests, and I am struggling to quite understand it. Maybe I just didn't spend enough time kind of drilling down. But you mentioned the phrase pivot to China. And so what is that? And it does seem to me, again, as a cynical libertarian, that these guys are like, this is just like a new, I'm not a video game guy, being as old as I am, but like Call of Duty comes out with like new editions, right? It's like, well, you're over here, and now it's like this war theater. So to me, it seems like the foreign policy establishment is like, okay, this is going to be a cool little game to play. Let's pivot to China. So like, who is who is really driving this, as far as the, Trump and Biden and Obama come and go, but there are people who are setting policy. Who is driving it? Why are they pivoting to China? And what do they hope to accomplish? Do they have a plan, or are they just like, hey, let's just boot this up and see what happens?
Yeah, I think it was announced by the Obama administration in 2011. The pivot to Asia is what they called it. And basically it was just, a massive military buildup. I think in part you're right that this is just like the new theater, right? So now we need all new weapons. The army is getting specific precision missiles that they could put on the first island chain that have like a strike range of 200 and 250 miles, right? Like these are very specific weapons being built to fight China. And so part of that is just, right, like it's good for all the think tanks, it's good for Lockheed Martin, it's good for Raytheon, it's good for all the Pentagon departments and everything like that, because it makes sure they all have new things to do for coming years. At the same time, I think among the swamp and the political class, there is real anxiety about the rise of China and that America cannot dominate the world. I mean, if you really think about this, Taiwan is just, it's a few hundred miles off the coast of China all the way. I mean, this is the policy that we're talking about. It's the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Ukraine is, right on the border of Russia. We want to be able to control and say what happens in pretty much the entire world. Maybe China with their true like mainland territories like Tibet, yeah, we can't do anything about that, but we really want to be able to control and dominate the entire world. And so I think the policy in Ukraine, the policy in Taiwan, it's really about trying to harm Russia and China's geopolitical standing. And I mean, that if China does go through and invades Taiwan or carries out any military activity against Taiwan, that will hurt Beijing's international standing. Like nobody wants to see that, right? Like, that people don't enjoy that. I mean, allies of these countries are going to look the other way. Like Pakistan isn't going to come out and start condemning, or Russia's not going to condemn Beijing for this. But I think it is, it will hurt Beijing's geopolitical standing, especially as a lot of countries see it as a non-imperial alternative to America. But Beijing will be willing to do that because they see it as an internal and very important issue, especially it seems to be a top priority of the Chinese Communist Party at this point.
Yeah. So, so you mentioned that there, something about, are we trying to increase like actual, you said Trump, are they moving men and machines over there? Are they trying to open new bases? Like what's the strategy? And in my sort of little rant before, like I left out the thing that you included is like, obviously, weapons manufacturers and people like that are driving this because like, well, there's just a new market and all that. So like how much is actually, are they trying to put over there, and they're expending a lot of diplomatic capital doing this, I guess?
Yeah, so there's a lot of money flowing in a lot of different ways. I think the CHIPS Act was recently signed by Biden, and that's definitely in part like a counter to China. Without the threat from China, there's no way that spending bill like hundreds of billions of dollars would have been passed. If we look specifically at the Pentagon, they're building new ships because they need a bigger fleet. They're putting new missile defense installations in Guam and South Korea. They're selling weapons to Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, Australia, India, all, in the name of this mission against China. The U.S. has formed new agreements with, as I talked about in the opening, South Korea and Japan. There's, a particular trilateral agreement. We have the AUKUS agreement. That's America, Australia, the U.S., and the U.K., where we're sharing new nuclear technology with the Australians. We have the Quad, which has been called in some respects the Asia NATO. That's India, Australia, Japan, and America. And, that is a pretty strictly anti-China alliance. And so, yeah, everything you're saying the U.S. is doing, the defense budget, it's hard to pick, this billions for China and things like that. If they're, agreeing to build 3 new ships, they're building those to confront Russia, China, and to control the world, but, to specifically allocate the money. But there is particularly the $7 billion Pacific Defense Initiative, which is just all spending on weapons to go into the theater against China. So there are some packages which we could pick out of the DoD budget that are specifically directed towards China, but a lot of it is just our overall increase in investment in new space capabilities, new missile defense capabilities, new missile systems. Is a lot of money we're sinking into all these systems, and it's hard to imagine we would be doing it if it wasn't for the pivot to Asia and looking to attack China. It's also created a situation, Aaron, where it's a different kind of warfare, right? Europe, Russia, Ukraine, this is a land battle for the most part. China, the U.S. is going to have a lot of naval assets. Maybe we have installations on islands and things like that. And so every piece of the Coast Guard is working with Taiwan. The Army has to figure out to make sure that they're not going to lose budget, get cut out. They have to come up with battle plans and reasons to be fighting against China. The Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, everybody has to come up with their new way to get in on the China honeypot, which just makes it so much bigger, right? Because now the Army has to have their own missiles and their positions there. It's not just the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force.
And sort of another thing that I think's been kind of interesting over, again, this year is the fact that kind of how things have shaken out with Russia, Ukraine, is that it seems to me that, you wouldn't know it from, listening to the American media, but I think that they have, again, the American foreign policy establishment has made another big mistake of other people kind of being on Russia's side, or just it's just another reason for them to not like the U.S. And so, again, getting back to the risk metaphor, is that, if you have this, if you are concerned about China, it seems like they're doing everything they can to make it so everybody else either doesn't care or is kind of favoring China and Russia and stuff like that. So am I right on that? How has the Russia-Ukraine thing changed, or has it changed direction on how people want to cooperate with the U.S. versus maybe standing up to the U.S. or ignoring it or whatever,
So, we got the global South, which is kind of like a leftist term to use. But these are mostly countries, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, maybe even the Middle East, you count in that. But, basically non-white people of the world and those majority countries. And look, when they see what the U.S., even if China invades Taiwan tomorrow, even though Russia has invaded Ukraine, all the if you listen to media from India, from Pakistan, from South America, from Africa, there's a lot of people who will say, well, how is this any different than the Iraq war? Why are we supposed to not trade with Russia because they invaded Ukraine, but we maintained or deepened our relationship with America after you killed 1 million people in Iraq and invaded and destroyed the entire Middle East? It's just the hypocrisy, I think, is so obvious to people around the world. And also, look, people are going to go out for their own interests, right? The African people are not going to starve to death to punish Russia for invading Ukraine. They're not going to stop importing Russian wheat and fertilizer because the people of Africa need that to live. And the U.S. shouldn't ask that. Now, they do say that, we only want you to import Russian wheat and fertilizer, but, economies need a lot of different resources, right? And so food's the obvious one, but everything China and Russia make a lot of things that a lot of people around the world need to, either make their everyday lives tolerable, more efficient, or just, bare bones need to survive. And So they're not going to cut off trade with these. Maybe if the U.S. really had been the shining city on the hill for the past 70 years or 80 years, in the post World War II liberal international order really did try, did what its advocates pretend that it does, then maybe the U.S. could rally these countries and try to isolate Russia and China a little bit more, and maybe the way that North Korea has been isolated. But I mean, if we look at what's happened in the past 80 years, nobody's going to do that, because obviously the countries leading the moral crusade are the more immoral people on the planet.
Yeah. So what's going on Russia, Ukraine right now? Is there still no negotiations on the horizon, or is it? I haven't heard much of anything change lately, but I haven't looked at it real closely in the last couple of weeks. So what's going on over there?
Yeah, so Russia continues to slowly take Ukrainian territory, not just the historic Donbass region, but also the south of Ukraine, moving west somewhat towards Odessa, towards Moldova. But I'm not sure how much they're making a push. They're still miles and miles from Odessa, so that we're not at any, I think, critical point in the war. I think we're going to just see Russia continue to slowly take more territory in the east and south of Ukraine at this point. Ukraine seems to have no interest in negotiating. The West seems to have no interest in pushing Ukraine to negotiate. The only country that really, the only third-party country that really seems to want to end this war is Turkey, and they've negotiated this agreement that's allowing wheat to leave Ukrainian ports. Either Russian or Ukrainian wheat can now leave the Black Sea. And so this is great, but we actually had the Western countries say that Turkey's, position here and how close Turkey's president Recep Tayyip Erdogan is with Putin is a problem for the West. Like, it's not that, okay, Turkey is making some progress on negotiations here, so we're going to just back off and allow Turkey to do whatever they need to do. No, we're going to publicly condemn Turkey for trying to end this war. It's really crazy. Now, I guess the one other thing I should mention is Ukraine has carried out a couple attacks in the Crimean Peninsula. Apparently, 2 Russian ammo dumps were hit. Maybe one person died in both attacks. Russia actually on the second one called it sabotage. On the first one, they were really trying to downplay it. Ukraine has recently discussed that, hey, Crimea is a big tourist destination for Russians, so tourists shouldn't feel safe going to Crimea this winter. A lot of threats going on there. This could be a major escalation, and it could lead Russia, I think, to stepping up the amount of force that they're using in Ukraine. But we will have to see how this develops. Maybe the one kind of positive thing I could point to is the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Turkey's President Erdogan will be in Kiev or Lviv and then Odessa maybe this week for talks with Zelensky. And as I said, these are maybe 2 of the people who are really interested in actually ending the war and ending the conflict. And this is the first international visit to Zelensky that doesn't seem like the people going are likely just there to be like, oh, you're doing such a great job, what can we give you for the war effort? I think that these 2 people are going to try to pressure Zelensky to say like, hey, we need to find an end to this thing.
So what do you see playing out? Like if Russia continues to like strengthen their position, so obviously I would think Russia is doing this thinking, the more territory we take and hold and the stronger our position is on the ground, the more leverage we have when negotiating. But like the West seems to be committed to not negotiating. So like, how does that logjam break? Like, does Russia have to keep going further than they want to go? Or like, that's where I get worried, is that if, the West has kind of dug in on this position, are they really going to come off it at some point? Or are they going to say, okay, well, you finally pushed us too far, and now we're going to do, something drastic?
I mean, fantastic questions. One thing that I've said throughout this war is we really don't know what the Russian goals or battle plans are. So many people like to say, well, in the early weeks of the war, Russia really tried to take Kiev, but that failed. And then you have other military analysts like Douglas McGregor, who will point out that, you know, Russia's push towards Kiev wasn't actually about taking Kiev. It was about drawing Ukrainian forces out of the Donbass, allowing Russia to take that territory much, much more easily in the east and south that they really desired. And then after that, you know, Russia has kind of gone on this strategy of slow military gains, slowly taking territory. My guess is this continues. You know, Russia is somewhere between 20 and 25% of Ukrainian territory now. In the coming months, I'm sure they'll surpass 25%. My guess, this is just my guess. If I were, you know, I guess trying to create a security situation in Europe that was the most livable for Moscow, I would guess that they're going to take Odessa and take Ukraine's entire Black Sea coast, or continue to move that way and continue to take this territory until Ukraine, you know, agrees to whatever demands that Russia has. It seems that they're interested in some of these eastern cities and that they are going to take territory even outside of the historic Donbass in the east. Some of these are, most of these, I think, are Russian majority speaking cities. They've taken territory in the south. So if you look at a map of Ukraine, you see the Crimean Peninsula on top, the Dnieper River, you know, kind of almost splits the country in half. I think Russia will stay to the east side of the Dnieper River, but they will continue to take territory on that side, except for in the very south and moving towards Odessa. And I do think they're going to continue to take territory moving north from the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine's south. That seems to be important to them, especially as Kiev attacks Crimea. I think Russia will see that territory as important to being able to defend their interests there. And there is the breakaway area of Moldova, Transnistria, that is, you know, Russian backed. I think there's like 1,500 Russian troops there. If they do, you know, take Odessa, I assume Russia will go all the way to Moldova and link up with Transnistria to give the either allow that to be still a breakaway province of Moldova, just with more Russian support, or to just, you know, make the whole coastline there an official part of Russia. I do think Russia will probably, and that's quite a bit of the territory they've taken. It'll just, you know, maybe be whenever Ukraine is willing to negotiate, if it ever is, you know, maybe Russia just takes the territory and solidifies it that way, and that's the way it goes. But my guess is at some point Ukraine will negotiate, and, you know, there may be some territory trades here and there that affect what the current battle lines are. But again, the east, the south, the Black Sea coast, I think is, and particularly the Sea of Azov that borders the Crimean Peninsula, Russia, Mariupol, and all that. That's just going to be a Russian lake forever now.
Yeah. So you just think at some point the U.S. is going to just have to be like, oh, okay, we, you know, to accede to that?
I mean, you know, we have used this very dark phrase, fight the last Ukrainian, but at some point I do worry that basically Ukraine is going to run out of young men and women who are willing to continue to die in this meat grinder. And then at that point, Zelensky will have to make some very hard decisions to make sure that, you know, his entire government doesn't collapse. And that's when I think we'll see negotiations. I don't know if that's 6 months, a year, or what, but it's some time out, and there's going to be a lot of dead Ukrainians and Russians between now and then.
Yeah. Yeah, it's horrible. And speaking of horrible, and I always hate doing this because it's like it seems like it's always an afterthought. But Yemen, you know, there was a big push, something in the Senate a couple of months ago, and I know I put it out an email. Mises Caucus had people call and, you know, email their senators, representatives, whatever, and then I just didn't hear anything. So like, is the deep state just committed to this is just going to keep going, or any good news on that front?
Yeah. So it's not terrible news on Yemen this time, Aaron, I promise. There's been a ceasefire going on there, I think, for about 5 months now. I think we're about on month 6. It's been renewed as in 2-month segments. So that is somewhat unfortunate because a longer ceasefire agreement produces more ground for talks and for international aid and development projects and all this. But it has been helpful to have these ceasefires in place. For the most part, they've held up. The Saudis aren't carrying out airstrikes in Yemen. The Houthis aren't carrying out missiles attacks against the Saudis. Now, one really important thing that hasn't really gone at least as efficiently as it should is I believe the Saudis were really supposed to almost end their inspections campaign of ships going into Yemen, carrying fuel, food, just cargo and things like that. And those inspections have continued. And so the amount of just goods getting into Yemen hasn't been what it should have been for these past several months. And so, of course, there's a lot of people there still suffering, dying. The amount of infrastructure damage that was done by Saudi's bombing campaign over the past 8 years is going to take years and years and years to repair. Not only to figure out how to, resolve all these new power and tribal disputes in Yemen. Right now, the only fighting really going on in Yemen is between the UAE-backed Giants Brigade, which is a lot of them are the people who were members of AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and then paid off by the UAE to no longer be AQAP to fight for the UAE. So we have essentially the Salafist militia, the Giants Brigade, fighting against Al-Islah, which is, I believe, the Muslim Brotherhood, and for whatever reason, the Saudis are backing them in Yemen. The Saudis usually don't like the Muslim Brotherhood, but I guess they're so powerful in Yemen that they're backing them there. So that's the minor fighting going on in Yemen right now. And then, so you brought that up. It's so important. The Libertarian Party, Aaron, the Libertarian Party got taken over by libertarians. As you mentioned, there's a libertarian impulse to have like an Ancapistan world. But one of the things that really bothered me in Reno, and one of the things I really realized was wrong with the Libertarian Party, all the candidates that were running against the Mises supported candidates were up there saying, Aaron, they would close their speech with this line that sounded more like something George Bush would say than libertarian. We believe in a world set free in our lifetimes. I mean, this is like horrifying to me. Like, my God, how do you plan to set the world free in your lifetimes? Like, what kind of dictator are you going to be? And
it's a very Jacobin French Revolution. Like, oh yeah, we haven't even started on America, but now we're gonna. And I don't think that's the thing. Is some of them may kind of actually believe that, but most of them it's just kind of a naive, like, oh, this sounds cool, but they don't realize the implications of what that would actually lead to.
But anyways, Angela McArdle is now chair. The Mises caucus supported candidates are in place. And what do you know? We're not like going after voting rights. We're trying to end the war in Yemen. This is the first major campaign of the new board of the Libertarian Party. Scott Horton helped to, make it so that we're working alongside all these great groups. A lot of them are left wing, like Co-Pink, the Friends Committee, and all these people, to try to do everything we can to pressure our representatives in Congress to pass a war powers resolution to end the war in Yemen. Congress is currently on recess right now, but this is now introduced in both the House and Senate. I think it's going to pass the House for sure. I'm not really worried about the House. What happens in the Senate, what Biden does with the bill is all questions. But every single time that there has been major political pressure or increases in the amount of support that, the war powers resolution has been to get in Congress, it has had an impact on the war in Yemen. Maybe not the biggest one, but at one point it ended the mid-air refueling. It's helped to limit weapons sales and U.S. involvement. So, even if this doesn't bring the war in Yemen to a grinding halt, it is hugely helpful. I mean, there has been a 5-month-long ceasefire right now. That hasn't happened. Yemen has been under daily airstrikes, nearly daily airstrikes for 8 years until 5 months ago. And I think largely it is the increasing pressure in the United States against supporting Saudi Arabia in ending this war. And so we need to keep this pressure up. Once Congress is back in session, they may be moving on these bills, and we'll probably all have to make calls to our senators really this time and say, like, hey, you have to be on board with this. We need to end this war. It does nothing for America, and it's only going to create problems going forward in the future.
Yeah, well, that's good. Is there, tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what's going on, Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, how people should check out what you're doing and what we have to look forward to from you.
Yeah, so I work at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. At the Institute, I'm the news editor. At antiwar.com, I'm the opinion editor. So if you go to antiwar.com, look at the viewpoints, the spotlight. I'm working on that every day, making sure the most important articles, written about the wars in the world from the anti-war perspective are right there for you every day to read. The man, Dave DeCamp, is the news editor at antiwar.com. He writes several articles every day about what's going on in the world. So if you want to keep up with happening in China, Russia, Iran, that really is mostly Dave DeCamp, but also Jason Ditson, antiwar.com. I try to contribute a little bit. I do a daily news roundup at the Libertarian Institute that I point out, but I also write, most days I'm writing at least one news article as well. The one I wrote yesterday, I talked about right at the start of the show, co-authored with Will Porter, going over, what happens with North Korea as the U.S. builds up its military presence in the Indo-Pacific. So, and then conflicts of interest, the show I co-host with Connor Freeman.
All right. Sounds good. I always enjoy your work. You guys are, especially antiwar.com, but also Libertarian Institute. It's just, there's too much stuff to read, and that's a good problem to have. And it's good that the most important things are being covered in depth by people like you. And so we'll have links to all that stuff on the show notes page. And we'll hopefully nothing super horrible will happen. And the next time we have you on, it'll be to talk about the end of the war in Ukraine or Yemen or both or something like that. So it's great to see you again, Kyle.
Hell yeah, sounds good, Aaron.
And there you have it. I'd like to thank Kyle Anzalone for his time and wisdom, and for just all the hard work he does. He's one of those guys that you can never stump him. He always knows a little bit about what you're asking him about, if not a lot. We have links to several of the things that Kyle and I talked about. It's over on the show notes page at decentralizedrevolution.com/86. That's just the numbers 86. Thanks to Dave vs. Goliath for all the music you hear on Decentralized Revolution. Thanks to co-producer Simon Kalpin. And thanks to everyone who subscribes to our email list and gives to Mises PAC at takehumanaction.com. And to everyone who shares, rates, reviews, and subscribes to Decentralized Revolution. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.